Okay, so my last video cut off unexpectedly, no idea why, but the point I was trying to make is that this 511 account most likely does not have a cost of sale account associated with it. We looked at the spreadsheet that the product had provided for us, and since it has no cost of sale account associated with it, we would just set that to null. This is one of those things that if you're not sure, you can just keep going through the report identifiers, make a note, and then whenever you get the bulk of them done, you can say, hey, do these accounts that I have added have cost of sale accounts associated with them, and then you can come back and update the statements after that. It's just kind of important to get the bulk of the work out of the way before you ask product. You don't want to add, if you have 300 inserted statements, you don't want to have to ask them for every single inserted statement. So so that would be it for our insert statement. And so you can run this insert statement. It should add into OEM account the account, and then we can run the query to see that we added it. I forgot that I actually ran the statement already in the last video after it cut off, but that's why we have two entries here. You would not want two entries normally. So just keep that in mind. You should only have one account whenever you run the statement. So that's how we get the account in there. Now, that's not really the goal of what we were trying to do. So let's just, as a quick refresher, we wanted to add in hold on, let me bring up the correct spreadsheet. For page 8, cell M5, we wanted to add in this report identifier and the information associated with it. This should point to account 511. So that's the goal of what we're trying to do here. So again, we can look at the report identifier table. It looks like this. There's an ID, OEM make ID, an account ID, report identifier, calculation type, calculation order, and formula. And we'll need to fill in values for each of these columns. If you're not sure how to do that, you can go to the Confluence page, and there is a section called Adding a Report Identifier, which is an account balance. And that is what we're trying to do. Account 511 is an account, and this value should hold whatever balance is showing in that account. So that's what we're trying to do, and there is an example, some information you can read through, as well as some examples that are worked through here, but ultimately this SQL statement is the one that we're going to be using. So let me see, hold on, let me find it again. Okay, so it's this one. So we can copy this out and then take a look at what that SQL statement actually does. Okay, so here we're inserting into financial statement report identifier table, and then we're going to go through the columns here. There's new ID for the GUID, OEM make ID, this will be 15 for GM, it's 14 in the example that I have in the Confluence page. This ID, the account ID, we're going to use the predicate of this statement right here, this last part, to look that up, so we'll talk about that here in a second. But that will be the account ID. The report identifier, remember this is the value that is right here in the cell on the version of the GM financial statement with report identifiers. We'll copy that and we'll put it in here, and I'm going to go through all of this in just a second. Then there is the calculation type. If we look at the various calculation types, we can see that one is for account balance. You'll also be using statistical formula and gross profit pretty often. But for this example, we're doing an account balance. These last two, not as often, so we won't worry about those, although we can look at references in Hyundai to see whenever those are actually used. Calculation order is a little bit complicated to explain, but I've written a tool that will update these after the fact. So for right now, we're just inserting 0 for a calculation order. And then formula. Formula is for report identifiers that use formulas, which we have quite a few of those. If you have a formula, you will not have an account balance. If you have an account balance, then you will not have a formula. So you will usually not have both of these at the same time. If the calculation type is 3, it'll be a formula, and otherwise that column will be null. So if we wanted to, for our example, insert a report identifier, we could modify this statement to use the values from the GM financial statement. So ID, again, this is just a random GUID that we can have the system generate. Because the statement is written this way, the GUID will be different in every single environment, which is why we have this last piece of the query, which will actually look up the account by the account number and the OEM make ID. So that's where we get this ID value, right? So new ID for the first column, right? This OEM make ID should be 15. For GM, it'll always be a 15 when we're working on the GM financial statement. This ID we'll look at here in a second whenever we get to the where clause, but we'll get that to pull in the correct account ID. This will be the account that we just inserted up here for account 511. The report identifier, so we can get the report identifier from our TB edit with report identifier. So we'll just click this cell, hit Control C to copy the report identifier, and then we'll paste it in here. Right, so that's our report identifier. Calculation type is an account balance, which we just went over. So we'll leave this as a 1. Calculation order, I said that we had a tool that will determine this later on. So we'll leave that as a 0 for right now. And then because it is an account balance, we'll leave the formula as null. And to be sure to update our predicate here at the end, we are trying to look up count 511. So we'll change this to 511, and then our OEM make ID to 15. And then we can run this statement to see if it will insert correctly. And it did. It actually inserted 2 rows. This would not normally be the case. This is just because I accidentally duplicated my OEM account whenever the video broke. So usually we would just have the 1. And we can look at our account financial statement, report identifier table, where report identifier equals this in order to see our insert. In this case, like I said, we have 2, but normally I only expect 1 to show up here. And that is how we insert a report identifier that points to an account. There's one simple modification you can do. Some of these values will be in these columns called like gross. If it says gross, it's going to be the same insert, except we're going to change the calculation type. So if we look at our, well, I guess it doesn't matter, but if it is one of these gross columns, like these report identifiers, for example, it'll be the same type of insert. The only difference is that this calculation type, if we look at the different types, will be 4. There's a special calculation type for any columns that have gross profit. And the reason for this, if we want to get into the accounting stuff, is because these rows use the same account, okay? So like we'll have a sales account. This is the, the sales part is the balance in the actual account. Gross is actually the sales minus the cost of sales, and our stored procedure that populates these values knows that. So as long as we send it essentially, or we save a value of 4 for the calculation type, it'll know to pick the gross instead of the sales account. The leftmost column, which is common to see, is a little bit more complicated, so we'll hold off on that for right now. I do want to show one more type of entry, which is for these lines that are totals. Here we'll have like a report identifier, but instead of this relating to an account balance, these will actually be formulas. And we do have an example of that in our Confluence page. So again, if you go to your Confluence page, there is report identifiers, formulas, and statistical data. Adding a report identifier, which is a formula. There's a section dedicated to this, which shows you kind of like how you would insert with a full like SQL statement example like we've seen with a formula. And in fact, further down the page, there is a specific example using the GM financial statement, which you can find here. which shows an example of what a report identifier and its formula might look like in a GM financial statement. So just very briefly, in cells like this, like total lease and rental income, so let's look at the actual TB edit financial statement. If this is the original TB edit, this is the one without the report identifiers. If you double click in these cells, actually that one doesn't seem to work, I may have messed it up. Here we can see that it has a sum, and Excel will indicate which cells we're actually adding up. Sum means to add up, and the range of cells here is outlined in blue. It may be difficult to see, but it's H14 through H21. So the expectation is we'll write a formula which will add up all of these cells. And you would get the report identifiers for all of those cells by going back to the TB edit with report identifiers. So in this case, it would be all of these cells added up. And a database, or excuse me, a row in the database that looks like that, if we look at our financial statement report identifier table, we can see in the formula column that this is kind of the format. You'll have each of the report identifiers inside braces, and then you'll add them all together via that formula column. So that's kind of like, I think, the next step after we get the account balances in. But there are quite a few of these account balances that need to be added in. So I think that this is like a good starting point to get some inserts written based on that. So there are several videos, if you look in the design session chat history, that you can sort of review. You can watch this video. I think probably the clearest reference, though, is this Confluence document. It can be very boring to read through this like several page long document, but keep in mind there is a table of contents. So if you are just adding in an account, there's a specific short, section that you can read and look up an example from. If you need to add in a report identifier that references an account, you got it right here. If you have a formula, it's right here. And then when you get to the point where you're adding in these units right here, these are what we call statistical data. There is a section in the Confluence document which talks about how to add that in as well. And then there may be other pieces in the financial statement that haven't been thoroughly discussed. But as always, you can reference the Hyundai stuff. We already have the Hyundai stuff in the database, so you can download this file, open it up, look at those documents, and compare the database entries for Hyundai, which is any of the entries for OEM make ID. I believe it was, let me just look to be sure, 17. Yeah, 17. So for instance, on the financial statement report identifier table, if we looked up the OEM make ID equals 17, these are all of the report identifiers for Hyundai, which is a statement that we have in the system, and it works correctly, so we can use that for reference whenever we have questions. If there's no one around to ask at that given moment, and or really even before we ask people, we can just check how Hyundai does it, and maybe base our decisions based off of that. And if we're really stuck, we can reach out and see if anybody can help.